You- Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be back here with Tony.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Dan. I'm glad to be back here too. It's
Tony just
an adventure.
moved cross country and is in a new magic place in the Southwest, and it's all exciting. It's cool.
It is. It's a big change, big
Yeah,
upgrade. So far, so good.
and you look good.
Yeah,
So,
it's really good.
yeah. So today's conversation is about the science behind fire crystals, basically the Atlantean crystals, the Vogel crystals, and to try to really understand deeply the science. And how this conversation began is Tony and I did a series of interviews about his work teaching remote viewing. And one of the things that Tony said was that remote viewers seem to do better when there's an obelisk involved. And he was studying that, and then he got involved with the crystal stuff. So, Tony, if to start with your story, first the obelisk versus the water versus the remote viewing, that part of the story?
So, well, researching from my third book, Beyond Sight. So it's called Beyond Sight: A Hidden History of Remote Viewing and Psychoenergetics. In the research that I did for that book, I began to look at connections between military psychoenergetic research and kind of connections about monuments. So I started to look at monuments as what if these monuments are not just markers? What if this is actually has a purpose? And it just one thing led to another. It was kind of a snowball. Like I spent a lot, I would write a page, but I would research 80 pages of things. And so in the months that I did that, it kind of led me down the rabbit hole. And what I realized is that the ancient obelisks that are made out of red granite that were quarried specifically from a certain quarry in Egypt, where it had a high quartz content, and were terminated the same way that the Vogel crystals are terminated at the top, but budded at the bottom. The other thing was that an acquaintance of mine knew somebody at the Boboli Gardens
Globally,
in Florence,
right.
Boboli Gardens in Florence. And that person was um, in a fraternity in that area and said that it was very famous for the waters, the quality of the water. We always hear about Florence, Italy, the wine quality is very high and is famous for their water quality. And I looked at that and I thought, wait a minute, this dovetails into the story of Marcel Vogel, who created wine from tap water and ran it 7 right turns around a Vogel crystal that he had charged. And they had measurable effect on the outcome, on the quality of the water and on specifically the wine. And I went, wait, hold on a minute. And when I looked at, and then I began to look at the array on Google Earth as I do everything. I like to travel places and see it for myself, as a matter of speak. And I noticed that there were some stark similarities between both the Karnak site, where the obelisks were all taken from. All of the Egyptian obelisks that the Romans took, they're in London, they're in Turkey, they're all over. The Boboli Garden obelisk came from the Karnak site. The one at the Vatican came from the Karnak site. And I went back to Karnak and I looked, and we have an array, a vertical array that looks a lot like an acoustical array, but when you really look at it, it looks like it has positive and negative arrangement. And we have similar distance between the obelisks and a water source or a water output. So
That's
the
the point.
Nile River.
Yeah. And that's
The
where Tony and I
Boboli
got,
Gardens has the river.
yeah, sorry.
Say that.
That's where Tony and I got excited because we began to realize that what we had been talking about as a longitudinal array, which is the place where the compression nodes meet, and we think globally that looks like this, is the place where the longitudinal component output of the crystal slash obelisk inputs to the water being profoundly receptive to the longitudinal component. And Tony mentioned also the obelisk was a foci for the remote viewer, right? Was that?
So yeah, so we do remote viewing. We did remote influencing, and so when I first realized this, I traveled to the Cleopatra's Needle in New York, in Central Park. There is an obelisk there from the Aswan site, from the granite, and we did a remote. We did one of our techniques that we do in the remote, not only remote viewing, but psychoenergetic effects of the target, or remote influencing. And we had results. We had measurable results that we felt from people. Measurable in many ways. Like I'm sure if we used the Muse headset, we could see a more measurable thing. But there was something there. needless to say, there was something there. There was a result, and that led me to keep researching it. It's the Florence is the. I'm trying to look up the name of the river. It doesn't matter. So the Vatican is also has an array with an obelisk with a quartz array around it that's pointing towards a river. The Washington Monument has an array right outside. It's an obelisk with a specific type of material that it's made out of. We
Yeah,
found in Astana the same distances on vertical columns made out of quartz. And then when we look at the Eiffel Tower, and then there's a Luxor obelisk just north of the Eiffel Tower at the from the Arc de Triomphe. What I'm saying is the layout is essentially always the same, and we're seeing these things that could affect. And when you talk about the effect, some of the things that in Vogel's work, that you can affect thought from the water, charging the water into thought, and as you said that however the wave mechanics work down is something that I'm still trying to work out. You've got an aspect of that it was a pump wave generated by the user and not from a source, that it was the user's mind. But that also seems to have dovetailed in with historical accounts of what we have, that it was a specific sect of priests that had access to the Karnak site. And we also have outputs, we also have written records of output of grain that didn't match what modern day biologists think could have yielded in the Nile Delta. So they can't understand why they were so plentiful with the grain. But when we look at treating the water with the technology that we're aware of now, that we can do with these crystals, with a standard Vogel crystal, let alone the fire crystal, with what we're coming out with now that we have this, other people are kind of running with the baton, like you're doing with your crystal. People are running with the baton and trying to increase the effect and go in a different way. But this could be an ancient technology that's been among us and has been in use in our water supply all along, that can influence you. You could make an entire populace happy, docile, angry, sleepy, hungry.
and that's where we want to go later in this conversation. We're going to talk about the Atlantean karma of the fire crystal. And one of the things they did was basically enslave people by controlling their thoughts with this. And that's part of the Atlantean history, because we're going to do fire crystal karma. That's the climax of today. But just before we go there, Tony brought up so many useful things here, that obelisk was high in quartz content and presumably was both high piezo and high dielectric. And that's going to bring us back to these. Yes.
There is a like a 0.06 radioactive component in the red Aswan quarry, the granite, and as high as 60% quartz.
Yeah.
So they could obviously you can't find a 30-foot tall 10-ton piece of quartz. So they did it with granite. They did it with the granite, and then at the other part of the site, of the original site, the Karnak site, the array that's shaped like an acoustical array, like you said, is made out of sandstone, which is primarily quartz from the area. So it's made out of sandstone. We're having quartz, and then the modern versions have quartz arrays around them as well. The Washington Monument, the Vatican, the Boboli Gardens, and so on. So I have detailed a bunch of them. There's even similarity with the St. Louis Arch and with the architect of the St. Louis Arch with the Bell Labs grounds in Halmdale, New Jersey. So it's the same design. We keep seeing the same design with big water, little ponds at the end where you would generate the wave, pass it through an array to direct the wave, and a body of water on the other side, all at the same distances. I would assume have something to do with the wavelength or with repetitive times of the wavelength.
Yes,
so
related
to is like 90 feet long.
Related to Schumann, we would have to guess. And Tony has done some amazing work on the constancy of the distance from the water to the obelisk or dolmen, which means that the longitudinal wave is coherent standing we're talking about an array. That's exactly right. And another little clue that we don't want to skip over here is Tony mentioned that there was a low-level radioactive. Ooh, just to say that the Paul Brown nuclear battery was an example, over unity, was an example of a quasi-superconductive induced by very low-level radioactive. And in fact, now we believe that in addition, the mercury in the Vimana Hanabu Nazi Bell, the mercury vortex, not only was it doped with the iron powder, which made it red with that special solubility wetting agent, but the reports of radioactivity around the Hanabu were clear. They used low-level radioactivity for the induced quasi-superconductive, which then made that implosion more centripetal through Planck. And that's where we're going with this, is now we want to understand the principle behind, which is wonderful. But Tony has one more really fun story that I loved, which is when so now he's playing with his crystal and he's learning how to breathe into his crystal, and Tony manages to help heal his girlfriend by zapping the water. Do you want to tell us the quickie on that one? Cool.
So it's very true. So it was this crystal here. This is one that I got on crystallightandsound.com, I believe. It's a very nice quartz crystal, and I was using it to replicate the experiment with the water. So what turned me onto it the reason I went down this road is because I'm looking for method. I have a learning company, and I'm looking for methods to make learning easier. And I thought if we could have the intention of something like as simple as a B12. So you can imbue properties of things, and B12 before you study, it's been proven that 5 milligrams of B12 help a college student remember and cram for an exam. So I was thinking if we could imbue with this, the same method into just water, the properties of B12, you could drink the water, it would help a student prior to. So I was thinking, that was the research I was doing. I had a girlfriend stay with me, and she became very ill. She had a very severe infection, and she just fell ill. She was at 100 degree temperature and was very sick. And I was taking care of her for a few days, and I used the healing intention. One morning, I would bring coffee and juice in the morning, and she was in bad shape. And one morning, I imbued the water. Just the water. I brought coffee, orange juice, and a glass of water. And I imbued the water the same way and kind of just pushed it into the water the same way from Marcel Vogel's videos and from what I've learned. And just a healing intention, a loving healing intention into the water. And gave her that. She drank some of the coffee and was still in bad shape, high shivers and just bad. And she drank the water and she was immediately better. Within a few minutes, she stood up and said, "What was in that water? I feel great." And she had no idea that I imbued it. It was completely unknown to her. She drank the water, and then I said, "Keep drinking it, drink the water." And the symptoms went away and lasted about an hour and a half before they returned. So she had a severe infection. We eventually got her to the doctor, and she took an antibiotic and was fine. But for that time, the symptoms were completely alleviated. Her temperature went down and the pain went away, and she could stand up, and she was fine. So it leads me to believe that we could have kept going with the water and alleviated her symptoms. I was shocked. And then I told her after the fact that, hey, I imbued that water with the crystal. And that's what I said, "Are you absolutely sure?" She said, "Yeah, I feel great. I can't believe it." And the effects lasted about an hour and a half.
Yeah.
So she had a severe infection by that time. So early on, I think would have really caught it.
So we want to look at, do we understand the physics? Obviously, the nature of that intention is a beautiful and wonderful thing. But the other thing here is that if the harmonic cascade, called a phase conjugate pump wave, in that crystal is accurate, the amount of coherent longitudinal EMF that is emitted directionally from the core is increased. And the coherent longitudinal is the compressional component of the electromagnetic wave. And if the compressional component arrives in pulses that are symmetric, that becomes centripetal and negentropic. As in, we put a phase conjugate pump wave at therify.net into plasma, and we've been doing regeneration negentropy for people in 30 countries. We put it in plasma, in water. The point is, the compressional longitudinal component of that water, and now I have to tell my little story. So I'm sitting there next to Marcel Vogel. I think this is about in the 80s and 90s. And he's desperately trying to influence this plant on the plant polygraph with his crystal. And he's breathing, he's sweating up a storm and breathing densely. And his breath, we later learned, he learned to approximate what we now know, but I don't believe he did know, is a phase conjugate pump wave with his breath. example is the Mayer wave in the breath. And actually, this is our little excuse now to have a few pictures. Let's see if I can do this right. Okay, so here's in the Kundalini physics. This is what's called a phase conjugate pump wave. Obviously, it's a caduceus. And what's emitted is coherent longitudinal. Sometimes I think it's incorrect to call it frill, but it has been called frill or scalar. But the correct term is directional coherent longitudinal EMF. And it's this wave of implosion down to this Planck tuning. In this case, this is in the physics of Kundalini literature, my study at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. And these are the low frequencies in the spine liquid pump and heart rate variability controlled by the breath, the physics of Kundalini, and it's a phase conjugate pump wave. In green here, these are the low frequency tidal frequencies, which are the low frequencies that cause your sacrocranial pump to pump. As in Upledger, if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. But the key wave here is this one here, about 0.0959, 0.1 hertz, 10-second cycle Mayer wave, the most important frequency in the blood pressure, in the breath, and in the body. And that Mayer wave is also identical with the LF component here of the heart rate variability, which is the fastest way to measure immune health. So if your heart rate variability is making caduceus based on the Mayer wave, you can make that happen with your breath, and the 10-second breath cycle is the best way to fire that phase conjugate pump wave. So you could actually not just do the 10-second breath, but you could do the whole cascade in the breath called a caduceus breathing exercise, which is offered in several of our software packages, craniosacral-app.com and iThrive. And so this is the same pump wave here now in the brain waves as when we measure John Charles Moyen teleporting with very strong brain waves in this cascade. And now we know that why and how it is that phase conjugation creates peak perception. These are the brainwave harmonics. These are the Schumann harmonics in green. And this is the equation, planckfire.com. Wait. Yeah, no, I've moved. So anyway, the point is that you can do a phase conjugate pump wave with your breath more accurately if you understand the physics and therefore implode that crystal. And that, go ahead.
Real quick, could you explain the 10-second breath? So you're holding in for 2 seconds, exhaling for 2 seconds, waiting 2 seconds, like a box breathing. Is that what you mean?
It can be done as a box breath, but very simply, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out would be the simplest way to express. So that's called the Mayer wave breath. And actually, Heart Math Institute pretended to teach what heart coherence was, but the only thing they were teaching was that 10-second breath. That's it. That's all they taught. And they called that heart coherence, which is a start. Actual heart coherence is harmonic inclusive, not exclusive, because it's a completed cascade. That's all at realheartcoherence.com. The point being is that Mayer wave breath is the most powerful way to trigger Kundalini, bliss, fire crystals, implosion, because it puts you accurately in the cascade of planckfire.com, the perfected phase conjugate pump wave. And that's what this lecture is about, is how do we perfect the physics of the fire crystal, and what is it? So now the next part of the set of visuals that I kind of tried to get together here, Tony, let's see if I can do this. So we have started on firecrystal.com, where we demonstrate the physics and also gradually bring to practice new technology here. And firecrystal.com is spelled P-H-I-R-E, firecrystal.com. And we want to look at a few of those images, starting with this one. So what we believe is, and this was my email to Dan Willis, actually, that it's accurate phase conjugate pump wave only that causes the fire crystal to work, because there's that implosion through Planck that is the centripetal negentropic and net energy gain, and also what pushes out the coherent longitudinal. So you got to have an accurate phase conjugate pump wave. And so I told them what the equation was, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But here, this is a small image, but just so you see, the X, Y, and Z axis of the quartz crystal, first of all, on the Z axis, the long axis, is where the piezoelectric voltage appears, because it's actually on the perpendicular sides. But the Z axis is a slinky, it's a helix, and it's the slinky of SiO2 quartz that nests cubically in a tetrahelix, six-sided, that makes it piezo. Very simple. Visualize your slinky. If you pull on the ends, the sides get a little bit narrower. So there's a small motion, the sides get a little skinnier, connected or coupled with a long motion, pulling on the ends of your slinky, your helix. And that mechanical, and I do mean mechanical, coupling between the long wave and the short wave being the sides got a little skinnier, that's the voltage. The long wave is the phonon, the pressure, the sound, the stricture. So connecting a long wave to a short wave is what piezoelectricity is. And connecting a long wave to a short wave is making phone calls to God, and also how DNA works. So to understand the nature of piezoelectricity is the start. And the second step is to understand. Then, now I have an X, Y, and Z axis, and they're all vibrating multimodally. Now, if those harmonics together make a perfect phase conjugate pump wave, then you have a fire crystal, because then it's imploding, it's over unity, and you have a net energy gain, and you maximize the coherent longitudinal out. Now, I don't believe that Marcel Vogel knew what a phase conjugate pump wave was. Okay, I knew him for like 30 years. And, I was the one who told Dan Willis that Marcel Vogel admitted to me he did not know how to line his facet planes with his molecular planes. He was clear he did not know how. And I told Dan Willis that, and then Dan Willis published on his website that you had to align the facet planes with the molecular planes. And then he said the phase conjugate point is the vision point, which is what we've been teaching for 20 years. But here is an example of a phase conjugate pump wave, in this case, the EM drive, which takes microwave down that cascade. And when the microwave phase conjugate implodes, that microwave in a trapezoid makes gravity. It makes coherent longitudinal directional out. And the coherent longitudinal directional out, we know by Bearden's equation, is what a gravity wave is made of. So that's an example of tuning to that implosion. So this is the background for firecrystal.com, where we're trying to teach. And I was very grateful when I was talking to Tony, and Tony said, it isn't about personalities. It's not about politics. No. It's about empowering people with the actual principle of how this works. So at firecrystal.com, we're going to have some pictures here. Well, yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Well, these things work. So just what I did with this crystal is reason enough for people to learn this. So in layman's terms, you don't hear about this stuff. Most people, it's really woo, any kind of crystal. Most people have that are into crystals and different things, like it's a woo community. And I hate to say that in a way that sounds derogatory, but that's the best term to loosely fit it. But everybody that's into that knows they can feel this. So people that are intuitive or very empathic, they can feel what's happening and recording information on crystals. To most people that aren't, they're turned off by it, thinking that it's something like magic, or superstition. But the reality is that these work. And what I did was, proof of that. And then when you really look at it and scale up, these are big machines that have been used on us throughout history. Like these are giant machines that they've already existed.
In fact, there's a huge racial
memory. The principle of it. Dan Willis is a good friend of mine, and he's doing good work in open sourcing it all. And over time, these things are going to come out and be open source to everybody to experiment and do your own thing. I believe that Marcel Vogel was doing a trial and error.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what the wave really is either, but I'm doing trial and error and getting results.
That's exactly where we're going with this, that I believe that since Marcel Vogel didn't know what a phase conjugate pump wave was, he used trial and error, and he used the cone sides of the crystal to approximate a phase conjugate pump wave, where we know actually the contiguous gradation of a cone means virtually infinite number of harmonics in that crystal. So you can never get accurate coupling down an accurate phase conjugate pump wave unless the crystals are actually parallel sides, which we know from the fire crystal literature of Atlantis and Casey. But that's where we're going with this. So then what we said was that this phase conjugate pump wave is what drives pyramids to make longitudinal coherence and therefore pyramid wireless power. So whether we're studying a pyramid or a crystal, it's the same physics. You need that accurate cascade. So then after I had informed Dan Willis that you needed an accurate phase conjugate pump wave based on Planck fire, then Dan Willis published this slide here, said the harmonics you should use are 10, 20, 30, 50, 80, 130, 210, 340, 550 hertz, which is a simple Fibonacci, which in a climax, as the Fibonacci keeps going, it eventually reaches golden ratio. And golden ratio accurately is the wave mechanics, not Fibonacci. But the ironic thing was that this series of harmonics that Dan Willis published, how to pump your crystal, actually, now if I take my equation, planckfire.com, you simply take Planck length and time, the musical key signature of every wave in physics, and multiply by whole powers of golden ratio. That's it, planckfire.com, the cause of gravity, consciousness, and all life force and negentropy. So the frequencies you get are 11, 19, 30, 49.9, 80, 132, 211, 340. So within about 1 or 2 hertz, Dan Willis announced frequencies which are very, very close to actual phase conjugate pump wave, but not accurate, but a meaningful approximation.
Well, I have a question here, Dan.
Yeah.
So being that close, I mean, wouldn't you get some sort of similar effect? Like it doesn't seem like it would be impossible. These
I
are the,
think you would get useful effect. I
and
think
also wouldn't different input waves kind of have a different size to them?
Well, judging by my equation to predict the radii of hydrogen, nature does this very accurately. Nature does not approximate Fibonacci. Nature uses exactly golden ratio, and we have published equation that proves exactly golden ratio is the generalized solution to constructive wave interference, there for implosion, there for longitudinal. So what we think was it actually reminded me of the time when I invented Therify.net. So here are the frequencies that Antoine Priory, the antecedent of our Therify plasma system, used that he got from Lakhovsky and Rife and Tesla. He used 3, 10, 32, and 80 hertz. This is Antoine Priory using the best efforts of Lakhovsky, Rife, and Tesla, and he approximated phase conjugate golden ratio. So this in purple here is a phase conjugate golden ratio, 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8. So that's the actual correct cascade. So once I saw that, I knew that whoever got there did so by trial and error. Okay. So my suspicion is that whatever Dan Willis's source was for this cascade here, presumably ET, did not
Well,
know the principle or was hiding the principle, one of the two. Either one's not good, really. But the point would be that the actual principle was confirmed by the fact that they so closely approximated a pure phase conjugate pump wave. And also we have this slide here which explains the difference between Fibonacci and golden ratio. Fibonacci climaxes in golden ratio. That's where the cascade points to. The actual wave mechanics uses golden ratio accurately, which is why golden ratio is probably the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics and the geometry of hydrogen, because it's the implosion in hydrogen that makes gravity, and that's what makes the water receive the longitudinal. So we're not here to criticize Dan Willis. Absolutely not. And by the way, I love the work he's done on the history and his dedication. As you pointed out, he's totally sincere. But at the same time, I think that even though Dan Willis for decades was evaluating zero-point energy devices, he doesn't know that planckfire.com, that perfected charge collapse, is the cause and mechanism of all zero-point vacuum energy devices and the cause and mechanism of all fire crystals, that you actually must use the accurate cascade. And either way, in order to drive this thing, you need our technology is probably the only way you can produce like 30 harmonics accurate in the cascade to drive this piezoelectrically very accurately. Piezofire.com. Go ahead, Tony.
So Dan, I don't want to speculate too much or have like some kind of drama in this. Like I feel like Ford and Chevy is developing. And
Well,
I really do. I feel like it's a Ford and Chevy thing developing. And I think that both are like you. I don't know how far along you guys are with your with the fire crystal, but there are things under development here, and
yes, absolutely.
I just don't want to get on
No.
the record like you know these guys are right and these guys are wrong.
Oh, no. What we say is here's an example. So now here you have a piezo device, piezofire.com, to drive a crystal, and we're evolving this technology very rapidly. And so you can take that complex, whether you use Dan Willis's 10, 20, 30 approximation or use actual PlanckFire.com, far more accurate and powerful. And you can get a complete series of 20 or 12 to 20 harmonics in phase conjugate opposite piezo pairs, all programmed ready to go from the piezo source, piezofire.com. So we think that just the drive device alone here will be the ultimate tool to trigger these
So the
crystals.
other thing, I'm very curious about, so when you power this, what is the effect that you overall, like in a basic term, what is the effect that you're looking for? It's gonna.
Well, the lab where we're doing this, and this is an adapter why we're experimenting with various devices to couple the crystal. And by the way, I think your description of the pyramid-shaped top, the parallel sides, and the flat bottom of the dolmen is a pretty good introduction, because the sides which are not parallel can create a cascade, but the cascade cannot be accurately tuned. But where this testing is happening, it's our programmer, Patrick Bauty in Belgium, who is very advanced on he, in my opinion, is probably the world leading sacrocranial teacher. But he has a group of people that actually test our devices, plasmafire.com, piezofire.com, and they are very, very sensitive. So with the programming for piezofire and plasmafire, we use the flameinmind.com, which relates to the muse you just mentioned, that outputs the world's most perfect phase conjugate pump wave, the world's most powerful bliss binaural beat. And that also is programmable. You can trigger specific chakras. When you want to focus this one on your heart, here's a frequency recipe, and there's literature on that's very evolved, and we can do any of the chakras. It's quite powerful. And Patrick's very sensitive team is testing these things every day. So I do rely on Patrick for this. And this, as I say, is evolving. But this system has a track record with the piezofire, with plasmafire, with other devices, that we can trigger specific chakras by choosing the right frequency recipes. And that's all in great detail at flameinmind.com, where you see the Flame and Sound software. So anyway, but to respond to your thought, maybe I'm going to turn off this share here for a minute. Stop the share. Better. I don't think this is Chevy versus Ford. No. I think Dan Willis did something pretty exciting when he said 10, 20, 30, 50, 80, because he was within 1 hertz of PlanckFire.com. So obviously somebody at the other end, whoever that was, has confirmed PlanckFire.com that the principle is implosive charge collapse. But if you want to take that principle to its logical climax of maximum implosive efficiency, obviously, it's good to know the principle behind these crystals. And by the way, that was the last, well, there were actually 2 other parts of the slideshow I prepared for today, and I don't know if we'll get that far. One was, those cities that are floating, is it over Jupiter or Saturn, that Elena talks about all the time?
Jupiter.
Jupiter. Yeah. And so here is a city that's floating on a certain kind of rock. And she's saying, where does a scientist know how to get the kind of rock that floats with no motor? And
I'm not super versed on her recent testimony.
But I just wanted to share that if you understand the physics principle behind these things, it's also it basically conjugate charge collapse, but it's also not a mystery. So last visual, here's the last visual. So I have a website it's called Gravity Politics, goldenmean.info/gravity politics. And it's about this guy, Grebennikov, who very, very famously, this is Grebennikov, and he very, very famously found that when he walked over the insect skeleton mound, he started to float and affected plant growth. And he studied the charge dynamics of the insect skeletons, and you see pictures here. And he called it a cavity structure effect. And here you see the first of all, what you need to know is the insect skeleton has evolved to make a super dielectric skeleton, literally floats. And then the cavity structure effect is the fact that the cavity in the skeleton is a vortex implosive capacitance. Implosive capacitance drives a longitudinal. You know the story about the mailmen in Tibet, they could float because they evolved. Well, but the bees actually did. It's measurable. They evolved, and here's the effect on plant growth. And here's so he stuffs a bunch of this super dielectric capacitance in this little table device here, and here he is flying all over the place. Okay, he's flying. And so this is a very famous, very well documented, known story. But the physics is, what is the cavity structure effect that made that bone, that stone, float? And we suggest it's actually quite simple, that the stone that floats is a stone which is a super dielectric, but built into the stone is what actually Gerbenikos called the cavernous structure effect, which effectively means cone-shaped cavities. Now, if you get capacitance in a cone, hint, fire crystal, why is it that you then float? Because when capacitance implodes, properly tuned through a Planck threshold, it spits out a longitudinal wave coherently directionally, incorrectly called frill, which is, per Bearden's equation, proof of what a gravity wave is made of. So
That's the first I've heard of this. So
yeah,
it's interesting. It's a lot to think about right now.
yeah. You could actually once you understand what super dielectrics do, the classic example of a super dielectric is not only is a super dielectric what makes a phase conjugate mirror work, creating time reversal and negentropy, which allows the pine cones to kiss noses accurately in the super permissive dielectric media. That's a start. But that same super dielectric in the Olmec obsidian mirror enabled ancestor phone calls and painted on the bottom of Nostradamus's scrying cup. Hello. This was that remote viewing? Yes. Was that a phase conjugator?
Right.
Yes.
So,
Was that a super dielectric? Yes. So the closer we get to understand the physics of these things, the more empowered we are. Sorry, go ahead, Tony.
well, I was going to say that there's a lot of peripherals about remote viewing that create a better conducive environment to it, to have a better, and when you're doing this, it's the best thing about remote viewing is that it's immediately proven. So it's immediately confirmable because you have a target, you have somebody that knows nothing about what it is, and they do the data and they describe aspects of the target. It's immediately confirmable. So when you add a peripheral or create an environment that enhances remote viewing, you have immediate results. So
Yeah.
you can immediately tell if it works or if it doesn't work. And there are people that create environments and don't get any remote viewing, and it goes backwards.
Yeah.
So
And
the EMF waves, like you said, like we've talked about in the past, the transverse waves are actually a huge factor.
yeah.
Anyhow, I'm thinking out loud at this point.
Yeah, but no, so if we understood the physics of how the super dielectric, for example, the coating under Nostradamus's scrying cup and the John Dee's obsidian mirror and obsidian mirror that the Olmec used for phone calls to ancestors. So the phase conjugate material is a coupling node to the longitudinal array. That's the point. And understanding that the longitudinal array is the DNA, it's the hologram that works because of the coherence of the longitudinal nodes, the obelisk, for example. So we're beginning to understand the importance of the longitudinal array and the phase conjugators and the phase conjugate pump wave that allows you to connect with that array. This is the background of the physics here, yeah? So what I appreciate is that Tony, in addition to being very practical and teaching remote viewing, which I admire greatly, Tony is very open and curious about the physics, and he's right up there with us when we ask these fun questions. And so, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that there's always a lot to learn. So, looking at it from the point of just understanding how the wave collapses,
Yeah.
how wave collapse happens. And like I've been working with you and learning that. So just understanding that and the distances involved
How the
between the
wave
size we
collapses.
are. Yeah. And the
Planckfire.com.
distances involved
Yes. You can
between
predict
us
what
and
distances.
Planck.
Yeah. You can predict what distances will work and what distance it won't very accurately. It starts with hydrogen radii. Absolutely. So I think if we took your tables of the distance between the obelisk and the water, eventually.
Yeah, so and they seem to be have slightly different perturbed distances, but so are the sizes involved of the array parts and the obelisk. They're not all the same size, and some of them have different terminus on the top, and it's got to be completely on purpose. There may have been some trial and error because one of the early build of the Karnak temple was situated and seemed to be an experimental area. It seemed to be that they had an obelisk, they had an area, and the distance apart to one of their ponds was something that they were experimenting with. And then when they got it working, had the main system set up to affect the Nile River itself,
Yeah.
so they could charge it with
Fertilize, literally fertilize.
mental projection.
Yeah. And we've actually induced the vitamin C effect in water by projecting those frequencies in the water through a phase conjugator like piezofire. Actually, those experiments with Sal Giannotto. Exactly. That's the point. And the fact, that work on the Nile, it seems to relate to Hermes, who actually is Thoth, who was actually Nigashida, who was actually Enki's alchemy teacher. It all fits together. His symbol was the caduceus, which is phase conjugation. So yeah, the teacher there.
Yeah. I'm
Egypt.
not familiar with a lot of that about how it developed and a lot of those things. But here's one thing that's true is that we have modern monuments that are constructed in the same array. Specifically, like I said, the Washington Monument. The distances of the St. Louis Arch are the same, and there is an array there. There's a replica of a mausoleum, an ancient mausoleum with the same array and the same distances apart. And the St. Louis Arch is nothing like any of it's a design that's completely separate. The Eiffel Tower is set up with the same distances. And places in the Astana, the city Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, I believe, I'm saying that right, has many of these arrays set up, and even in Shanghai, other ones. So somebody out there has this knowledge and also has the clout and the funding to build these massive monuments that seem to be psychoenergetic monuments that can produce this effect.
Our friend actually wrote the book on George Eiffel of the Eiffel Tower being a profound alchemist. And
my internet is very unstable, so from the move, it's got to be upgraded soon.
But that the Eiffel Tower is made of iron, not steel, with a very particular acupuncture effect, actually. So this all fits. So the big picture here is that once you understand the longitudinal array, then you can understand pyramidwirelesspower.com. But Tesla actually, for example, he got the frequencies wrong and he got the nodal locations wrong for global wireless power. So he didn't understand phase conjugation produces the maximum longitudinal array coupling efficiency either. Actually, choosing 60 cycle instead of 50 cycle was one of the biggest mistakes of Tesla's life. Actually, you cannot make carbon nano grow in a 60 cycle factory because Tesla screwed up. He didn't know what 50 cycle is a perfect bingo to Planckfire. Yeah.
It makes me wonder if he was beholden to some sort of regulation in America. If there was some regulation or something that held him to that, because we're on what are we on, a 40 hertz?
50. America, US is on 60 hertz and Europe is on 50. And 50 hertz is the most commonly mentioned frequency in all cancer healing literature and the only way to grow carbon nano. And 60 hertz, no. The charge will not collapse. Bucky fullerene will not grow. Carbon will not implode. Oops.
It makes you wonder if like I said, when we look at these, also back then when they were determining the electric grid, they were building the Washington Monument, which also seems to have a hand in this technology. So there are people that are fully aware of this in secret that live among us. And so we see these things, and maybe the hertz of America, maybe Tesla had his hands tied on the way the hertz was. due to regulation from the people that knew how this worked.
Well, he clearly
Back.
knew what a longitudinal wave was, but he didn't know the relationship to gravity. We don't believe he made some earthquakes, we think, but coherent longitudinal. In fact, that leads us to the last subject I was hoping to do a little bit today, which is Atlantean fire crystal karma, starting with how did they make earthquakes? Essentially, and I think Elena did a great job on the Atlantean history in her seminar. I enjoyed it tremendously. And she repeatedly referred to the critical ingredient was the technology they had in Atlantis, but the key technology was the fire crystal. And studying further then, and I spent time in Casey's library, and Edgar Casey really pioneered what's called Tuoi stone, Tuoi, fire crystal literature. And actually, it's a physicist named Sutton who wrote all the papers on the Tuoi stone fire crystal in the Casey literature. And I spent many years with that. So, there's a little background to studying fire crystal versus Atlantean karma, because this is huge racial memory. And you brought up, which they mention in that literature, they used fire crystal to enslave large numbers of people. And when large numbers of people lose their individual freedom, you know what happens? Gravity is destabilized. Freedom and centripetal force are related.
Hold on 1 second. You're saying that using the technology, so I'm talking about water imbuement, using the monuments to imbue human thought into the water so that people that drink the water have the thought. And so you can drink the water, and let's say if I wanted to make it anger, a typical peaceful, and I'm just using this as a hypothetical example, a peaceful populace would drink the water supply given to them, and the electricity, the piezo electric would make them a tinge bit angry. So you're saying
Yeah.
that using and coupled with the way that it did actually would change
both in
gravity.
both in the plasma effect in the crystal itself becoming implosive and in a sense addictive. People want to follow that kind of leader. The crystal field is ultimately a living field when it's conjugate. But further, then of course you could imprint the water. So there's multiple ways you could use crystal technology for better or for worse to control people. And any sharp, powerful tool can be misused, of course. And this is in some detail in the Edgar Casey Tuoi stone literature. Final thought. Go ahead. You have one.
Well, I was just going to say about the work of the people we've discussed here today, both Dan and Elena. I've had no reason to suspect Elena of being anything other than accurate. So she's had a lot of things that she's brought forward that checked out. So she has a long list of things that have worked out.
Absolutely. And I
Your friend,
absolutely, yeah, we both
so I
absolutely honor Elena and Dan here. And Elena, particularly with her courage, there's only one minor caveat, in my humble opinion here, is that when it comes to physics, she said,
as these things get developed, so as these things get developed, so as of yet, I believe that the work is incomplete that they're doing. So as these get developed, there may be things that
well, for example, she depicted the red Sintamani stone as having to do with the fire crystal or the mercury vortex. And the Sintamani stone it's a mercury stone, but it's not high dielectric or high piezo. The reason the mercury vortex was red, we explained before. But again, I just think there's some details when you get down to the physics. And actually, it's quite simple. If you do not understand that Planck fire charge collapse is the reason gravity exists, the reason vacuum energy exists, the reason pyramid wireless power exists, and the reason fire crystal works directly. It is the only motor for life force and all negentropy. That's what PlanckFire.com is. It's absolute, it's real, it's solid physics. And until you understand that, you really can't teach how zero-point energy works or fire crystals or pyramids work. And that is the climax form of Hermes today. I think that's my humble opinion. I'm a humble student of Hermes, but that's what a caduceus is, phase conjugation. But anyway, we are in absolute agreement here, Tony, that we are so grateful to Dan Willis and also especially Elena for her courage here. But what I'm saying is there are some things you need an electrical engineer if you're going to talk about it. And am I being humble? But I think you might need me for that one. but what the last Well, I was just going to tell the last piece of the story about coupling the gravity field, but please, if you had any other thought on that, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, I have a really bad poor connection here.
Oh, yeah.
I was just thinking, I just want, it even says my internet connection is unstable. Yeah, like I said, I think that at the end of the day, developing these products separately is better
Yeah.
for everybody. So, if you think about it in terms of developing a motor, one person develops a motor that's arranged a certain way, one person develops another. And, when they're done, we'll see how they perform.
Yeah, yeah. Good, good.
And so,
And in the
Elena,
meantime,
the other thing that we're dealing with here is the existence of the Federation, who is directly supplying her, a third party that's supplying her and Dan with information. And so it's very important to recognize that we've had a lot of credible and very, very important information come from that source. And we need to keep in mind that that is something we want to support, that there's no reason to not think that the Federation is having a hand in helping develop these things. And so if both you and I can contribute in some way to the principles and the way that this works so that we have these products. Because you're talking about a crystal, you show the picture of the crystal, this little, to somebody that has no idea, and I'm holding up this one of this little tiny crystal that looks wooey. So somebody that has no idea the potential of these things,
power.
according to what they're doing with these crystals is powering literally an entire species, and many species of people are living off this technology. So
Absolutely.
the basis of this technology can change everything in the world.
That's right. In
And
fact,
so we really want to support it in every direction we can see it, this development of these things. We're not talking about a small thing. We're not talking about water treatment. We're talking about the entire infrastructure of the planet being changed
that's right.
with these technologies that are born from this sun.
That's right. Once, for
So it's
example,
a very important thing.
once carbon nano is working in a phase conjugate pump wave, fullerene, for example, that energy production, very analogous to the crystal, fire crystal, and to the pyramid wireless power, that energy production and propulsion production, the longitudinal wave, make every other form of energy and propulsion on this planet look like the Stone Ages. Absolutely. It's totally clear. But so this concept of this
And
the implosive phase conjugate pump wave is central. Absolutely. That's why we need the physics to be accurately taught. And but then back on to Dan Willis here, whoever told him 10, 20, 30, 50, 80, 130, hello, did they know what plankfire.com is or not? Were they hiding something or did they not understand? Either way, the principle is now verified.
well, we'll see. That it's going to be, where time will tell. The other thing is that like any important science like this, weaponry can be developed as well.
Absolutely. Sure.
So there's a lot of things that we need to,
Yeah.
that need to be considered here.
Yeah.
So, I don't want to fuel any debates any more than other than showing that this technology is real and it's coming.
Yeah. And
So,
so
this technology is coming.
yeah. And by the way, our carbon nano project, which is parallel and related, fractalfield.com/cold plasma, we have a whole team on that. It's that the Buckminster fullerene looks like this actually, and it's a phase conjugator, and it starts with carbon, and that's how Tesla started too. But there was a little climax story, very brief. I wanted to describe to end today's conversation, which was when I was studying the the Edgar Casey literature on the toy stone fire crystal. At one point, he said, and the moment when Atlantis really tipped over was when the scientists failed to realize that their fire crystals had coupled with the planet frequencies. That's a pretty approximate quote from the History of Atlantis stories. Now, why was the moment when the crystal actually entrained the planet frequencies when they had the big earthquake? Well, the planet frequencies are the Schumann cascade. The Schumann cascade is virtually exactly plankfire.com, meaning how do you either increase or destabilize the planet's gravity after, and I do mean only after you learn why objects fall to the ground, which is Planck fire charge collapse, then you can know how that crystal made gravity.
Well, we certainly don't want to give anybody that ability.
Well, it's like sharp knives and kids. Because sharp knives can cut, do you not give them to kids? No, you got to tell kids how their universe. The real sharp knife here actually is the fact that the human brain waves make the ultimate cascade, and that is the ultimate crystal. And that cascade is exactly PlanckFire.com, the alpha to gamma cascade in the brainwaves that enabled Jean-Charles to teleport with witnesses. We know why it worked, how it worked. He embedded strongly into the longitudinal array by the seacoast, by the way. So the principle is the point.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of potential here.
Yeah. And I just think that if we're going to be teaching, the history story of the fire crystal, the history story about enslaving people and gravity waves and all that is going to be mystical and confusion until we understand the principle of how these things worked. Why did they go so much trouble that all the pyramids, and as Tony says, the obelisks, are at exact nodal points in the longitudinal array, the exact same places that Bruce Cathy measured reduced nuclear critical mass? The first implosion device was a nuclear device was called implosion because they used longitudinal waves to create critical centripetal force. So why is there reduced nuclear critical mass measured, per Bruce Cathy, at these same longitudinal nodes, the same places that the Aboriginals insist is songline, which is the longitudinal physics of lucid dreaming and remote viewing is the longitudinal array. And oh, by the way, then Karatkov proves by measurement that if you want military quality telepathy, you got to be sitting at a longitudinal node, the same place Tony is saying that's where you need to go for leverage in your remote viewing. So it's about embedding in and inhabiting the array. That's the summary.
It's a whole new way to look at things, I think, for a lot of people. And just a lot for us to catch up on. There's a lot. I've been working on trying to demonstrate how a wave goes from a large wave and bounces into others and begins the caduceus. I've been working on that, on an animation for that, to bring out in the future. And I think that just getting the mechanics in a way that, you could teach a child in a cartoon is a big deal. I think once,
Yeah.
if you learn it at a young age, you're minded that way and you start to see it in nature. And, we need generations of people that are aware of these physics. So to come forward and be able to use it, like you said, giving a kid a sharp knife with the ability, with the knowledge of what it can do. And so most of this stuff, no one's ever heard of before.
Yeah. But you bring up a very useful point. So if the angle of the vortex is accurate and it's a golden spiral down the vortex, the animation is at fractalfield.com/conjugate mind. If the angle of the wave down the vortex is the correct angle, it's a 60-degree cone, and it's exactly a golden spiral down the implosion cone in the center of every face of this structure. That's the vortex cone, exactly right there. If that angle of that cone is correct, then the transverse does what's called optimized translation vorticity and comes out the nose of the squirt gun as a directional coherent longitudinal. And that all is tuned to Planck because Planck is the same for 1 billion light years in all directions, not because of the Big Bang, because that is a wavelength the universe has agreed on to constructively share, which is because that's how gravity is made and stabilized. So effectively, the reason golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics is because charge collapse optimized golden ratio is the only way to stabilize gravity, and not just atmosphere, but mind. So yeah.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there in just that statement alone. But what I was going to say about gravity, I have my own theories that at the Planck I mentioned this before about the check. My own theory that possibly some of the Planck waves are going out. So waves that are shrinking down and going to the Planck are accepting it, and they're, like you said, a drain hole.
Yes, it's the drain hole, and I think the fact
but we're also getting waves that are generated from the Planck that are coming up.
Yes, coming back. Yes, but that
so that means
that radio
What I'm
requires
saying
access
is
to
there
the
may be
nodes.
two separate forms of Planck.
Well, there's Planck time, Planck length, and there's h bar, but they're all related directly. Basically, it's the resolution of the quantum foam. It's the level at which any wave that disagrees with Planck is going to be canceled. So even if you're a billion light years away, you got to agree with Planck or you're canceled out. So, and that happens to be the musical key signature of the longitudinal array, which is DNA radio. And so basically, it's at the Planck threshold, there is a way out for charge at the compression center of the vortex. Oops, we lost Tony. And that way out, that's what Einstein could not figure out. He knew that Einstein knew that infinite non-destructive compression was how gravity works, but he didn't know there was a way out at the center. So when I wrote the equation for hydrogen radii tuned to Planck, I proved not just that hydrogen is fractal for the first time, but that at that Planck threshold is the release of the charge that Einstein couldn't figure out. And so that's the way out, exactly what Tony was saying. And that enabled distribution means the charge compression then was non-destructive. And that when the longitudinal wave comes out, the Planck squirt gun, that's what enables embedding in the array. And that's what makes gravity work and stabilize. That's why, planets are dodecahedral and all the fun stuff. So the relationship of Planck and gravity is essential to the very nature of mind, because mind works the same way. You inhabit the same implosion. Yeah. So I didn't mean to carry on.
I'm sorry. My internet connection is very unstable. I keep dropping and going on. I'm catching bits and pieces of this, but
Yeah.
very unstable connection.
I just wanted to thank you for your patience today, Tony, and thank you for being a pioneer, and thank you for your experiments. And you're absolutely right. So we all need to work together. And that was Elena's ultimate suggestion, that we collaborate on this and work together to optimize this principle. But I insist that the principle is PlanckFire.com, the phase conjugate pump wave, which I emailed to Dan Willis before he published the harmonics that fit PlanckFire.com. So anyway.
Well, you said you're insisting the science, what you're theorizing, what you're science.
We keep losing Tony. Try that again, Tony. Can you try that?
Yeah, it's just my internet's coming and going. But what I'm saying is your physics are sound. You've already developed a lot of things, but let's let them develop theirs.
Sure.
It's a good source.
Yeah. So what Tony's saying is the importance of Dan Willis and Elena's source, and how grateful we are that we have that source. Exactly. I guess we have to say goodbye without Tony here. Oh dear. Well, here's Tony.
Back again. So this thing keeps dropping and coming back. But what I was saying is that, even in my testimony and things that I'm working on, if I have disagreements in testimony that are out there, I just don't worry about it, and I polish my own thing that I'm working on.
Yeah.
So time will tell, and it's very important that this information, these technologies are made out. That's why I wrote it. I was sure to write it in my book Beyond Sight, which is about remote viewing. And the psychoenergetic monuments was something I put in there because I think it's very important that people start thinking about it.
And learn the principles. And on that note, I think we have to say goodbye here. I hate to say goodbye without Tony. It's too bad we lost Tony, but yeah, so that as people understand that these longitudinal nodes are the leverage point for the lucid dreaming, for the telepathy, for the song lines. And once you understand where the magnetic lines cross, you can use the sacred space in your own house and in your own property to enable you to embed in that array. It's so important. So I guess we have to say thank you very much and blessings. Tony will be back, we promise. Tony hasn't disappeared. To be continued. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.